I had been living in the neighborhood for a few months, quietly going about my daily routine, not really noticing the people around me. My work kept me busy, and honestly, I wasn't the type to go out of my way to make new friends. My apartment was simple, my evenings were predictable, and my circle of interactions was almost non-existent. But one Saturday afternoon, while trying to fix a loose shelf in my kitchen, I realized I was missing something crucial: a wrench. I stood there staring at the half-fixed shelf, thinking about how ridiculous it was that I owned a dozen random tools but not the one I actually needed. I debated walking to the hardware store, but then I thought of the neighbor I'd seen a few times in the hallway. She seemed approachable, always carrying groceries or tending to the plants outside her door. I hesitated, because knocking on a stranger's door to ask for a tool wasn't exactly in my comfort zone, but convenience won over pride. I stepped out, crossed the hallway, and knocked gently. When the door opened, I found myself looking at her properly for the first time. She had an easy presence, not overly formal, just casual and calm. She looked at me with a slightly curious expression, waiting for me to explain myself. I cleared my throat and asked if by any chance she had a wrench I could borrow. She raised an eyebrow, almost as if amused, then disappeared inside for a moment before returning with a shiny wrench in her hand. But instead of handing it over right away, she tilted her head and smiled faintly, saying, "You only came to borrow a wrench, nothing else?" Her tone wasn't accusing, it was playful, teasing. For a second, I didn't know what to say. The obvious answer was yes, but the way she said it made me feel like there was another layer to the question. Before I could overthink it, I blurted out with a nervous chuckle, "So, want to go out with me?" It wasn't planned. It wasn't smooth. It just came out, and the moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. She blinked in surprise, then burst out laughing. Not mocking, but genuine laughter, like she hadn't expected that reply in the slightest. I felt my face warm up, unsure whether I had just embarrassed myself completely. Still smiling, she handed me the wrench, shaking her head lightly. "You're funny," she said, almost dismissively, though not unkindly. I muttered a quick thank you and retreated back to my apartment, trying to play it cool, but my heart was beating much faster than it should have been for such a small interaction. As I tightened the bolts on the shelf, I kept replaying the moment in my head. Her laugh, her expression, the way she had looked at me. It all felt oddly significant. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe it was just an ordinary exchange, but something about it stuck with me. I realized I hadn't felt that kind of spark in a long time. It was ridiculous, I told myself, to read too much into borrowing a wrench. But still, the thought lingered. Sometimes the smallest conversations can open unexpected doors. By the time the shelf was fixed, I found myself smiling alone. Not because of the work I had finished, but because of the strange, unplanned invitation I had thrown out and the laughter that followed. It was just a few seconds of banter, but deep down, I felt it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of one. After that first encounter, things started shifting in small but noticeable ways. I began to notice her more often, not because she suddenly appeared everywhere, but because my attention had changed. I'd see her watering the plants lined neatly outside her door, adjusting the pots with care, sometimes humming quietly to herself. Other times she'd be coming back with grocery bags, balancing them with practiced ease. Each time, we exchanged brief greetings, and slowly those greetings turned into short conversations. At first, it was about ordinary topics: how the weather had been unpredictable lately, how noisy the street could get at night, or how the elevator always seemed to break at the worst times. They were conversations that could have ended in seconds, but neither of us seemed to want them to. She had a way of making even mundane topics lighthearted, and her humor came through in quick, clever remarks that always caught me off guard. I noticed how she teased me more than once about the wrench. Whenever the subject of tools or fixing things came up, she'd grin and say something like, "You sure you don't need another excuse to knock on my door?" I'd laugh it off, but inside I wondered if her teasing carried a layer of curiosity beneath the humor. With time, our exchanges grew a little deeper. She told me about her long hours at work, how she tried to keep weekends free for herself, how she loved cooking but never really had anyone to share it with. I told her about how work often left me drained, about the struggles of moving to a new place where everything felt unfamiliar. It was surprising how easily the conversations flowed, almost as if we'd been neighbors for years rather than strangers who had met over a borrowed tool. One evening, I returned the wrench I had borrowed. I knocked on her door and handed it back, joking that it had turned out to be more valuable than I thought. She gave me a puzzled look before I added, "Because it gave me a reason to talk to you." For a second, her expression softened, as though I had caught her off guard. She didn't respond directly, just smiled and accepted it. The silence after that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that lingers when words aren't needed. As days passed, our connection became part of the routine. I'd find myself looking forward to those accidental run-ins, the small talks that stretched into something more. There were moments when I'd catch her laughing at something I said, and it didn't feel forced. It felt natural, like the kind of laughter people share when they're at ease with one another. And sometimes there were pauses, quiet ones, where we didn't speak, but still felt present. Those moments said more than words could. It wasn't dramatic, nothing out of the ordinary, just two people slowly stepping into each other's lives through ordinary circumstances. Yet it felt significant, as if something was quietly building between us. The kind of bond that doesn't rush, doesn't announce itself loudly, but grows steadily, almost unnoticed. The turning point came when the neighborhood hosted a small community dinner in the nearby park. Everyone was invited, and though I usually skip such gatherings, she convinced me to come along. It was the first time we were seen together outside our hallway interactions, and something about being in that setting made our comfort with each other more obvious. People noticed how easily we talked, how often we laughed. I noticed too. That evening, surrounded by neighbors and the casual chatter of the event, I realized what we had wasn't just a passing connection. It was becoming something real, something I wanted to hold on to. As comfortable as things had become between us, there were moments that made me question whether I had misunderstood her. One evening, during a casual conversation outside her door, she mentioned lightly that neighbors dating could get complicated. She said it with a smile, almost as if it were just an observation, but the words sank deeper than I expected. I nodded along, trying not to show that it bothered me, but inside I felt an uneasy shift. From that day, I noticed myself stepping back. I didn't knock on her door as often, and when we crossed paths, I kept our talk shorter, safer, less personal. She didn't say anything about it, but I could feel the distance creeping in, like an invisible wall had risen between us. I told myself it was better this way, that maybe I had been reading too much into small moments, but I couldn't ignore how empty the days felt without our usual conversations. I tried to focus on work, filling my evenings with tasks and distractions, but it didn't help much. Every time I walked past her door, I remembered her laughter, her teasing, the little things she had shared. I realized how quickly I had grown used to her presence, how much I had started to look forward to it. And now, with silence stretching between us, I regretted not knowing how to bridge the gap. Then one late afternoon, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, there she was, holding a small box and smiling sheepishly. She said she needed help fixing a drawer that had gotten stuck, and she wondered if I had the right tools for it. For a moment, I almost laughed at the irony. The roles were reversed. This time she was the one asking to borrow something. I grabbed my toolbox and followed her to her apartment. The drawer wasn't difficult to fix, and while I worked, she stood nearby, making lighthearted comments about how unreliable furniture could be. Slowly, the tension between us eased, replaced by familiar laughter. It felt like we had slipped back into the rhythm we once had, as if the silence of the past few days had never existed. When the drawer was done, we sat for a while, talking again. She admitted quietly that she had been unsure about me at first. She said she didn't know if I had meant what I said the day I asked her out, or if it had just been a joke to cover the awkwardness of borrowing a wrench. I looked at her and told the truth, that I hadn't planned it, but I meant every word. I told her I never expected that small moment to matter as much as it did, but it had, because it brought me closer to her. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of thoughtfulness and something softer. After a pause, she smiled faintly, as though my honesty had reached her. That smile stayed with me long after I left her apartment. Walking back to my place, I realized that what I felt wasn't just curiosity or attraction. It was something deeper, something that had been growing quietly through every small exchange, every shared laugh, every comfortable silence. I didn't know where it was heading, but I knew I wanted to see it through. That evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I kept replaying her expression in my mind. It wasn't just friendliness. It wasn't indifference. It was something in between, something leaning closer toward the possibility I had been hoping for. And that small hint of hope was enough to make me believe the story wasn't over. It was just turning a new page. A few days later, I heard a knock on my door in the early evening. When I opened it, she was standing there, holding the wrench I had borrowed weeks ago. She lifted it slightly, almost like an offering, and with a playful smile said, "I think it's about time I returned this. Also, if your invitation for coffee is still on the table, I wouldn't mind going." For a second, I just stood there, caught between surprise and relief. Then I smiled and told her the offer had never expired. We ended up walking to a small cafe a few blocks away. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. The simplicity of it matched the way everything between us had unfolded so far. Quiet, unplanned, yet meaningful. Over steaming cups of coffee, the conversation flowed with an ease that made time disappear. We talked about childhood memories, the kinds of things we missed, the lessons we had learned the hard way. She laughed at my stories, I laughed at hers, and at some point I realized the world around us had faded. It felt as though the cafe existed only for the two of us. By the time we stepped out, the night had grown cooler. The walk back was unhurried, filled with moments of quiet comfort where words weren't necessary. I noticed how natural it felt to walk beside her, how unforced everything was. Nothing about the evening felt staged or exaggerated. It was just two people choosing to spend time together, and that simplicity made it special. In the days that followed, things between us began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. We didn't need to say much. Our actions spoke louder. She'd knock on my door with an extra plate of food she had cooked, and I'd return the gesture by fixing small things for her around her place. We shared laughs in the hallway, sometimes long conversations that stretched late into the evening. What once felt like a simple neighborly acquaintance was becoming something deeper, something that belonged to both of us. I often thought back to the very first day, the awkward knock, the teasing remark, my impulsive reply. It amazed me how something so ordinary had opened a door neither of us expected. A borrowed wrench had led to a connection that couldn't have been planned or forced. Love, I realized, doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it enters quietly, disguised as everyday moments, until you look back and see how much those moments truly meant. One evening, as I placed the wrench on a shelf in my apartment, I caught myself smiling. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It had become a symbol. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a piece of metal, but to me, it was the reminder of where everything began. A knock on a neighbor's door, a playful remark, an impulsive question. Those little things had changed the course of my days. Looking back now, I realize that love isn't about waiting for the perfect situation or the perfect person to appear in some dramatic way. It's about noticing the chances life quietly gives you and having the courage to take them, even if it feels clumsy or uncertain. What mattered wasn't how it started, but that it started at all. And with her, it felt like the beginning of something real, something worth holding on to.